The bullet hit before the sound did. That's what it felt like to the German grenadiers moving through the dry scrub hills of Tunisia in November 1942. They had fought across Russia and Libya and the deserts of North Africa. They were veterans, seasoned by years of war, drilled to perfection in the hard doctrine of the Wehrmacht. They had faced British Enfields and Soviet Mosins. They knew bolt-action rifles. They knew the rhythm of a firefight. Click. Fire. Work the bolt. Fire again. That was the cadence of infantry combat in World War II. Every army on Earth operated by it. But something was different now. Something they had never encountered before was across from them in that brown, rocky terrain. Something that didn't follow the rules. The Americans on those hilltops weren't cycling bolts between shots. They were firing again and again and again in rapid succession, without pausing. 8 shots as fast as a finger could pull a trigger. The Germans had walked into something they hadn't prepared for. They were about to meet the M1 Garand. To understand what happened in those North African hills, you have to go back much further. Back to a small factory town in Connecticut. Back to a quiet, bespectacled man who spent 15 years of his life building something that would change warfare forever, and never received a single dollar in royalties for it. His name was John Garand. He was born on January 1st, 1888, on a farm near St. Remy, Quebec, Canada. His father was a farmer. His family was large, 12 children, and poor. When John was 11 years old, his mother died, and his father moved the family to Connecticut to find work in the mills. John Garand swept floors in a textile factory while learning to speak English. He was a quiet boy, unassuming, with a mechanic's eyes, always watching, always taking things apart in his mind to understand how they worked. He learned forging and welding as a teenager, and before he was 18 years old, he had already patented 2 inventions, a telescopic screw jack and an automatic bobbin winding machine. This was not a man who did things halfway. By 1916, Garand had turned his attention to firearms. He had no military background. He had no formal engineering degree. What he had was an engineer's instinct and a machinist's hands. He began designing a semi-automatic rifle and, within 2 years, had caught the attention of the US Army. They didn't adopt his early design, but they recognized something in the man himself. In November 1919, he was given a position as a consulting engineer at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. He became a U.S. citizen in 1920 and qualified for civil service at a salary of $3,500 a year. In doing so, he surrendered any chance of future royalties from his designs. He transferred all patent rights to the United States government. He did it anyway. Because, as the Springfield Armory's official history records, he considered his work a gift to the country that had given him a home. What followed was one of the longest, most grueling design processes in the history of American military weapons. The Army Ordnance Committee demanded a rifle that could serve infantry, cavalry, and tank crews alike. They wanted it to use existing .30-06 ammunition stockpiled from World War I. They kept changing the specifications. They tested competing designs for years. Garand submitted prototype after prototype. 15 years he worked on that rifle. 15 years of revisions, trials, failures, and refinements. Working in the back rooms of the Springfield Armory, while generals argued about calibers and budgets and Army doctrine. On January 9, 1936, the U.S. Army officially adopted the semi-automatic rifle, caliber .30, M1. The world's first standard-issue semi-automatic infantry rifle. The Garand. It weighed 9.5 pounds. It was 43.6 inches long. It fired .30-06 Springfield ammunition from an 8-round en-bloc clip, a metal device that loaded from above and ejected automatically when the last round was fired. In the hands of a trained soldier, it could deliver 40 to 50 accurate shots per minute at a range of 300 yards. That was 3 times the rate of fire of the bolt-action Springfield M1903 it replaced. For comparison, a German soldier in World War II was typically armed with a Carabiner 98K. A bolt-action Mauser, an excellent rifle, accurate and rugged, capable of 15 well-aimed shots per minute in the hands of a skilled rifleman. The mathematics of the battlefield were about to be rewritten. The US Army did not rush the Garand into combat. Production ramp-up was slow. In the early days after Pearl Harbor, many American units were still carrying the old Springfield M1903 alongside the new M1. The Army was simultaneously training millions of men, building factories from scratch, and shipping equipment across 2 oceans. The first significant combat for the Garand came not in Europe, not in France, not on D-Day, but in the jungles of the Philippines in February 1942, when American and Filipino troops made their last stand on the Bataan Peninsula against the Japanese advance. General Douglas MacArthur reported on the Garand's performance there, writing to the U.S. Ordnance Department, "Under combat conditions, it operated with no mechanical defects, and when used in foxholes did not develop stoppages from dust or dirt. It has been in almost constant action for as much as a week without cleaning or lubrication." In those opening months of the war, the M1 began to earn a reputation. But the Germans hadn't encountered it yet. That changed on November 8, 1942. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, sent more than 100,000 American and British troops crashing ashore along the coast of Morocco and Algeria. It was the largest amphibious operation in history up to that point, and it was the moment American ground forces entered the fight against Germany for the first time. Photographs from the landing show the M1 Garand coming ashore in roughly equal proportion to the older M1903 Springfield. In some units, the transition wasn't complete, but the Garand was there, in the hands of Rangers and infantry soldiers alike, as they waded through the surf and seized French coastal gun batteries and pushed inland toward Oran and Casablanca. The early opposition at Torch came primarily from Vichy French forces, not Germans. But that was about to change. As the Allies pushed east toward Tunisia through November and December of 1942, they moved directly into the path of German and Italian forces rushing to fill the vacuum. By January 1943, American infantry were in daily contact with the Wehrmacht for the first time, and the Garand was in their hands. The German soldiers who encountered them for the first time noticed something that didn't make tactical sense. These Americans were not cycling bolts. They were not pausing between shots. A single American rifleman was producing a volume of fire that, by the cadence of it, should have required 2 or 3 men. German grenadiers trained to exploit the brief silence between shots, that fraction of a second when a bolt-action rifleman was working the action and was most vulnerable to a rush, found that silence didn't come. The rules of infantry combat they had mastered over 4 years of war no longer applied. To understand just how significant this was, you need to understand how German military doctrine actually worked. The Wehrmacht did not fight primarily through individual rifle marksmanship. German infantry doctrine was built around the machine gun, specifically, by 1942, around the MG-42, one of the most fearsome weapons of the war, capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute. The MG-42 was the centerpiece of every German squad. The riflemen were, in a sense, there to protect and support the machine gun. Individual German riflemen, armed with the Kar 98K, were expected to fire precisely and conservatively. Ammunition discipline was emphasized. The idea of an individual soldier firing 8 rounds in rapid succession, semi-automatically, ran against everything in their training. There is a record in the German Gewehr 41 development files that captures the mindset perfectly. German firearms publications in the late 1930s had actually featured photographs and descriptions of the American M1 Garand after its 1936 adoption. The German High Command was aware of it. They had studied it. And by 1940, they had initiated a formal development program to create their own semi-automatic infantry rifle, the Gewehr 41. The problem was, they couldn't make it work reliably. The German High Command imposed a peculiar set of design restrictions on the Gewehr 41. Engineers were told that no holes were to be bored into the barrel for tapping propellant gas, a fundamental gas-operated mechanism that Garand had used brilliantly in the M1. They were told there could be no moving parts visible on the exterior surface of the rifle. The result was a mechanically overcomplicated weapon that functioned poorly in field conditions, particularly in the mud and cold of the Eastern Front. Nearly 13,000 Mauser-pattern Gewehr 41 rifles were produced, but the design was plagued by failures. In testing at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, where American engineers evaluated captured German weapons, the G41 demonstrated reliability far below the standard of the Garand under the same harsh conditions. So there was a painful irony unfolding in the hills of Tunisia in the winter of 1943. The Germans had known about the M1 Garand for years. They had tried to build something similar and failed. And now, on the ground in North Africa, their grenadiers were facing it for the first time in actual combat, and discovering that years of doctrine and training had not prepared them for what it meant to be on the wrong side of a semi-automatic rifle. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, fought in February 1943, became the most brutal education of the war for American forces. But it also told a story about the Garand that history has sometimes overlooked. On February 14th, Rommel launched his offensive. Two veteran German panzer divisions, the 10th and the 21st, smashed through American positions at Sidi Bou Zid in central Tunisia. The Americans were outmaneuvered, outgunned in armor, and outgeneraled. Their commander, General Lloyd Fredendall, had placed his headquarters miles from the front in an elaborate underground bunker, while his troops were scattered across a 30-mile front with no unified command. The Americans were driven back more than 50 miles in 5 days. It was a humiliation. There is no other word for it. 6,500 American soldiers became casualties. Nearly 100 tanks were lost. The press called it the worst American defeat of the war. But buried inside that catastrophe was something worth noting. The German grenadiers who assaulted American positions at Kasserine Pass did not find the American infantrymen easy prey. Even when outflanked, even when their officers had failed them, even when the tactical situation was hopeless, individual American soldiers holding defensive positions with their M1 Garands extracted an extraordinary cost. 2 veteran Panzer Grenadier regiments led the assault at Kasserine Pass. They had fought across the Eastern Front and North Africa. They were among the best infantry in the German army. And yet, the attack bogged down. Hours of fighting, in difficult terrain and poor visibility, with the Americans maintaining sustained rifle fire that German doctrine was not built to answer. Buelowius, the German commander at Kasserine Pass, committed regiment after regiment to dislodge the Americans. Rommel himself, passing along the road that day and watching his own troops struggle to move, was reportedly frustrated by the pace of the advance. The Americans eventually broke, not because of the infantry fight on the ground, but because of German armor and air superiority. But the small arms engagement told a different story. Even untested, poorly led American riflemen, armed with the Garand, could hold veteran German infantry longer than anyone expected. General Omar Bradley, who later replaced Fredendall and helped rebuild the US II Corps, would write that the American soldiers' fundamental qualities, toughness, adaptability, fighting spirit, were never in doubt at Kasserine. The failure was in leadership and coordination, not in the fighting man. There is nothing wrong with the common American soldier, wrote war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who was there. His fighting spirit is good, his morale is okay. The deeper he gets into a fight, the more of a fighting man he becomes. And that fighting man was armed with the Garand. Rommel withdrew from Kasserine Pass before dawn on February 23, 1943. The Allies reoccupied the pass that same day. 6 weeks later, at the Battle of El Guetar, American forces, now under the command of George Patton, met the 10th Panzer Division again, and this time they did not break. Patton's men held the pass, destroyed 32 German tanks, and sent the Afrika Korps reeling. By May 13, 1943, the last German and Italian forces in North Africa, more than 250,000 men, surrendered to the Allies. Tunisia fell. The door to Europe was open. The Garand had gone to war with an army that didn't entirely know how to use it yet. What it had proven, even in that confused and painful first winter, was a fundamental truth about firepower. The weapon that lets a man fire more accurately, more quickly, and more continuously under the worst conditions is the weapon that wins. But the Germans were learning too. Back at their weapons facilities in Germany, engineers were studying the lessons of North Africa and the Eastern Front, where the Soviet SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle had also proven its worth against Ka 98K armed German infantry. The failed Gewehr 41 was redesigned from the ground up. Engineers scrapped the overcomplicated bang-type gas system and adopted a simpler short-stroke piston mechanism, one they studied directly from captured Soviet SVT-40 rifles. The result, entering production in October 1943, was the Gewehr 43, the G43. The G43 fired the standard 7.9257mm Mauser cartridge and held 10 rounds in a detachable box magazine. It was semi-automatic, reliable under field conditions, and could be fitted with a scope for precision marksman. The Wehrmacht intended to equip each infantry company with 19 G43s, 10 of them fitted with telescopic sights. It was a capable weapon. Historians generally consider it inferior to the M1 Garand in overall reliability and ease of maintenance, but it was a serious military rifle, and it existed because the German army had seen what the Garand could do. Only 400 2000 G43s were produced by the war's end. The Garand outproduced it by more than 13 to 1. Over 5.4 million M1 Garands were manufactured during World War II alone. Germany never solved the fundamental problem. They entered the war committed to a doctrine built around bolt-action rifles and machine gun superiority, and they could never fully rebuild their industrial and doctrinal infrastructure fast enough to change that. By the time the G43 reached the front, in meaningful numbers, the tide of the war had already turned against them. The Garand continued its journey through the war, into Sicily in July 1943, onto the Italian mainland in September, across the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, through the hedgerows of France, across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany itself. With each campaign, the rifle's reputation grew. American NCOs and officers who had been issued lighter weapons began trading them for Garands. The 30.06 round could penetrate doors, masonry, and the thick undergrowth of the Norman hedgerows in ways that smaller caliber weapons could not. Men who went through intense urban combat in Italy and France trusted the Garand above all else. General George S. Patton, a man not known for generous praise of anything, told the U.S. Ordnance Department on January 26, 1945, "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." He meant it. He had watched what it could do. There is one detail about the Garand that became part of the mythology of the war. The distinctive metallic ping sound the rifle made when the empty clip ejected after the 8th round. Some American veterans insisted that German soldiers had learned to recognize that sound and would charge the moment they heard it, knowing the shooter was momentarily empty. The truth, as careful historians have documented, is more nuanced. German veterans interviewed after the war generally said the sound was inaudible in the noise of combat. The physics of a firefight, the concussive blasts of artillery, the overlapping crack and thump of rifle fire, the engine noise of vehicles and aircraft, made the soft metallic ejection of a rifle clip essentially impossible to distinguish at any distance. But the psychological weight of the story tells us something real. American soldiers took their rifles seriously enough to discuss even theoretical vulnerabilities. They cared about the weapon. They trained to work around it. Some veterans even described a counter-tactic, throwing an empty clip to simulate the sound, trying to draw a German into exposing himself. Whether those moments happened exactly as described, the attitude they reflect is accurate. These were men who understood their weapon, trusted it, and thought tactically about every dimension of its use. On the other side of the wire, the Germans were paying attention too. In a larger sense, the story of the M1 Garand and the German response to it is a story about institutional momentum. Germany's military establishment had spent decades building a doctrine centered on the Mauser bolt-action rifle and the general-purpose machine gun. Senior officers distrusted semi-automatic rifles for infantry. They feared soldiers would waste ammunition, fire carelessly, lose the disciplined fire control that German doctrine demanded. They were not entirely wrong. These were real concerns. Ammunition logistics in World War II were a constant problem for every army. But they were catastrophically wrong about the larger equation. What the Garand gave American infantry was not just rate of fire, It was psychological dominance. A Garand-equipped GI moving through hostile terrain could respond to a threat instantly, without breaking his sight picture, without removing his hand from the stock. 8 rounds, fast and accurate, before his opponent had cycled a second bolt. That difference, half a second here, a full second there, was the difference between life and death in hundreds of thousands of individual firefights across 6 years of war. The Germans introduced the STG-44 assault rifle late in the war. The first true assault rifle in history, firing an intermediate cartridge in fully automatic and semi-automatic modes. It was a remarkable weapon that influenced rifle design for decades, pointing toward a future that includes the AK-47 and the M16. But it came too late, in too few numbers, to change the outcome of a war that had already turned. What it confirmed was the lesson the Garand had already written in sand and snow and mud across 3 continents. Individual firepower matters. The man with the faster rifle has a structural advantage that tactics and discipline alone cannot entirely overcome. John Garand never received the $100,000 Congress considered awarding him. The bill failed to pass. He retired from the Springfield Armory in 1953 at age 65, having spent 34 years there. He lived out the rest of his life quietly in Springfield, Massachusetts, visiting the armory in his later years, watching the country he had adopted continue to evolve. He died on February 16, 1974, at the age of 86. His obituary in the Springfield paper described him as modest and unassuming. A man of average build and average appearance, one newspaper had written of him in 1941, with the quiet shyness of the absorbed technician. More than 6.5 million of his rifles were built. They fought in World War II and Korea. They were exported to more than a dozen Allied nations after the war. They are still fired today at marksmanship competitions, still carried by military drill teams, still chambered by collectors who appreciate what they represent. Every one of those rifles carries the name of a Canadian-born machinist who swept floors in a textile mill, took nothing for his work but his civil service salary, and spent 15 years solving a problem that changed the outcome of the deadliest conflict in human history. There is a moment worth imagining. A German grenadier, somewhere in the cold hills of Tunisia, in the grey winter of 1942. A seasoned soldier, a professional, a man who has fought on 2 continents and survived. He is advancing on a position held by these new Americans, untested, unprepared, nervously gripping rifles he doesn't yet know how to use. He expects the bolt. He expects the rhythm he has always known. He counts the seconds between shots because he has been trained to count them, because in those seconds is the moment to move. But the rhythm never comes. 8 shots in rapid succession. Then, across the distance between them, that faint metallic sound, a clip spinning through the cold air. He did not know what it meant yet. He did not know the name Garand. He did not know the story of a Canadian boy sweeping floors in Connecticut, or the 15 years of work in a Massachusetts armory. He did not know that he was hearing the sound of a new kind of war beginning. He just knew that something had changed. Something fundamental, something that the bolt in his hands could not answer. The world he had trained for, the world where a rifleman cycled a bolt, was already over. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. This is history that deserves to be remembered. Not just the battles and the generals, but the quiet engineers and the anonymous soldiers who carried the weight of a world war in their hands. If this video added something to your understanding of World War II, please hit the like button. It helps more people find this channel, and that means more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week, we bring you the stories behind the weapons, the decisions, and the men who shaped the greatest conflict in history. And ring the notification bell, because the next story is already being written, and you won't want to miss it.